There's a sound an engine block makes when something is wrong with it that no amount of training can fully prepare you for. A sound that lives somewhere between a knock and a whisper. And the first time I heard it come out of that old Ford tractor, I knew before I ever pulled a single bolt that this rebuild was going to be different from anything I'd done before. Most bad engine sounds tell you exactly what they are if you've spent enough years listening. A rod knock has a particular rhythm to it, heavy and metallic, like someone tapping a hammer against a pipe in time with the crankshaft. A valve tap is lighter, quicker, almost nervous. This sound was neither. It was deeper than it had any right to be, coming from somewhere that didn't match the geometry of the engine I thought I was listening to, like there was an echo inside the echo, a second heartbeat hiding behind the first one. I stood in that barn with my hand flat against the block, feeling the vibration travel up through my palm, and I remember thinking, with a certainty that surprised me, that's not right. That's not how this engine is supposed to sound at all. I've been doing this work long enough now that my hands have their own memory, separate from whatever my mind is consciously thinking about at any given moment. 30-some years of turning wrenches, of feeling for the particular give of a bolt that's about to break versus one that just needs a little more penetrating oil and patience, of learning to trust the small vibrations traveling up through a socket wrench before my ears even register a sound, has changed. My late husband used to say that a good mechanic doesn't fix machines with her tools so much as she listens to them with her whole body, and I thought that was a romantic exaggeration for most of the years he said it to me. I don't think that anymore. Not after this particular tractor. The tractor had come to me the way the strange ones always seem to, through a phone call from a man clearing out his late uncle's property, a Ford that had apparently run fine for years, and then, without warning, one October morning simply stopped making sense. Not stopped running entirely. That would have been simpler, more ordinary, the kind of failure I could have diagnosed over the phone in 5 minutes. She still turned over. She still fired, most of the time, on a good day, with enough choke and enough patience. But she ran rough in a way that defied every diagnostic step I threw at her, and she made that sound, that low, doubled, uncanny sound every single time she idled, and no carburetor adjustment, no timing correction, no amount of fresh fuel or clean plugs made a bit of difference. I want you to understand something about how I approach a mystery like this before I tell you what I found, because the process matters as much as the discovery. I don't tear an engine apart on a hunch. Machines are expensive to disassemble and even more expensive to reassemble wrong, and a good restorer learns patience the hard way, usually by rushing into something once, early in her career, and paying for it in wasted parts and wounded pride. So I did what I always do first. I listened. I listened with a mechanic's stethoscope pressed against a dozen different points on that block, mapping the sound the way a doctor maps a heart murmur, trying to triangulate exactly where inside that engine the strangeness was coming from. And every single time, no matter where I placed the stethoscope, the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, diffuse in a way that real mechanical faults almost never are, because real mechanical faults have a source, a specific point of failure you can eventually pin down if you're patient enough. There's a particular quality to the light in my barn on autumn evenings, low and amber, slanting through the gaps in the siding boards in thin, dust-filled shafts that make the whole space feel more like a chapel than a workshop. And I remember that light especially well from the weeks I spent chasing this particular sound, because I spent so many of those evenings simply sitting on an overturned bucket beside that idling engine, doing nothing more productive than listening, letting the smell of warm oil and old diesel settle into my clothes the way it always does, waiting for some detail to reveal itself that my conscious mind hadn't caught yet. Diagnosing a machine this stubborn isn't really about tools at that stage. It's about sitting still long enough, often enough, that the machine eventually gets tired of keeping it secret and lets something slip. I check the obvious things first, because obvious things are usually right, and any restorer who tells you she skips the obvious things in favor of chasing mysteries is either lying or hasn't been humbled enough times yet. I pulled the head and found valves in reasonable shape for their age, nothing that explained a sound this strange. I checked the crankshaft journals, the rod bearings, everything that a normal, ordinary engine problem would show itself through, and everything came back clean, or at least clean enough that nothing jumped out and announced itself as the obvious culprit. I want to be honest with you about how unsettling that is, as a mechanic. You expect problems to hide, but you expect them to hide in the usual places, tucked behind a worn gasket or a scored cylinder wall. You don't expect a machine to simply refuse to show you anything wrong at all, while continuing, stubbornly, to sound wrong every single time you start her. It was my late husband who taught me, decades ago, that when a machine won't tell you what's wrong through the normal channels, sometimes you have to ask a different question entirely. And the question that finally occurred to me, late one evening with a cold cup of coffee going untouched on the workbench beside me, was simple enough that I felt almost embarrassed it had taken me this long to think of it. I stopped asking what was wrong with the engine, and I started asking whether the engine I was looking at was actually entirely the engine it claimed to be. Ford tractors of this particular era have a well-documented casting pattern, numbers stamped into the block itself at the foundry that any restorer worth her salt can cross-reference against a parts manual to confirm exactly what she's working with. I'd checked those numbers early on, as a matter of routine, and they'd matched what I expected, at least on the surface, at least on the parts of the block that were easy to reach and easy to read. But that stethoscope work had planted a seed of doubt I couldn't shake, a nagging sense that the geometry of the sound didn't match the geometry of the engine I thought I understood. And so I did something I don't do lightly, something that changes a straightforward rebuild into a much bigger undertaking. I decided to split the block. Splitting an engine block is not a decision you make on a whim, and I want you to understand the weight of that choice before I tell you what I found on the other side of it. It means hours of careful disassembly, removing every bolt in a specific sequence to avoid warping the casting, documenting every step with photographs so you can put it back together correctly, and accepting that you may spend an entire weekend confirming nothing more exciting than the fact that you were wrong, that the strange sound was something mundane after all, some resonance quirk of an old mounting bracket that any sensible mechanic would have checked before going to this much trouble. I accepted that risk anyway, because by that point, the mystery had gotten under my skin in a way that made peace of mind more valuable to me than the hours it would cost. There is a specific ritual to laying out an engine's guts across a workbench that every good restorer develops over the years. Her own private system of organization that looks like chaos to anyone else and reads like a map to her. I use painter's tape and a permanent marker, labeling every bolt and bracket the moment it comes free, arranging them left to right in the order they were removed, so reassembly becomes a simple matter of reversing the sequence, rather than relying on memory that might fail me 3 weeks later when the new gaskets finally arrive. That afternoon, working alone in the barn with a space heater humming against the autumn chill, I filled 6 trays before I even reached the halfway point of the disassembly, and I remember thinking, somewhere around the 4th tray, that I had never in my career needed this many trays for an engine this size, and some part of me, the part that had learned to trust its instincts over 3 decades of this work, understood before my conscious mind caught up that something about this particular Ford was going to be larger, more complicated, and stranger than its outward dimensions suggested. The disassembly took the better part of 2 days, working slow, working careful, laying every bolt out on a labeled tray so I'd know exactly where it belonged when the time came to put her back together. And when I finally got the block open, when I finally had both halves of that casting sitting on my workbench under the shop light, I sat back on my stool and stared at what was in front of me for a long, long moment before my brain fully processed what my eyes were telling it. There was a second engine inside the first one. I need to explain what that actually means, because it's not a phrase that makes intuitive sense until you understand tractor engineering, and I didn't fully understand it myself in that first stunned moment. What I was looking at wasn't a second complete engine in the way you'd picture a spare motor sitting in someone's garage. It was smaller, older, a compact single-cylinder power plant, clearly hand-fitted rather than factory-installed, welded and bolted into the housing of the larger Ford engine in a configuration that made no sense according to any manual I'd ever studied, using mounting brackets that had been custom fabricated, not stamped from any factory tooling I recognized. It was as though someone, decades ago, had taken an entirely separate, much older engine and built the larger Ford engine around it, encasing it rather than replacing it, the way you might build a new house around an old fireplace instead of tearing the fireplace out. I spent a long time just looking at that smaller engine before I ever touched it again. The way you might stand back from an old photograph before you let yourself study the faces in it too closely. Its casting had a rougher, more primitive texture than the Ford components surrounding it, thicker in places where a modern foundry would have shaved material away to save weight, with tool marks along its surface that looked hand-finished rather than machine-ground, the kind of imperfect precision that speaks of a craftsman working with whatever equipment he had on hand, rather than a factory with specialized tooling built for exactly this purpose. There was a maker's mark stamped into one flank, worn nearly smooth by decades of heat and vibration, and no matter how many angles I tried it under the shop light, no matter how much fine steel wool I used to clean away the grime, I could never fully make out what it said. Just enough of a shape to know letters had once been there, a name some now-forgotten manufacturer had been proud enough to stamp into iron, lost now to time the way so many small, honest companies eventually are. I ran my fingers along the welds, holding that smaller engine in place, and even to my eye, even without expert metallurgical analysis, I could tell those welds were old, decades old, done with equipment and technique that predated most of what I'd ever call modern practice. This wasn't some previous owner's recent modification. This was something built into the very architecture of that block a long, long time ago, hidden so thoroughly that it had apparently passed through who knows how many owners and who knows how many routine services without a single person noticing, right up until a strange doubled sound finally forced someone patient enough or stubborn enough to go looking. I called around to every old iron specialist I knew, describing what I'd found in as much technical detail as I could manage, and I got a range of reactions from polite skepticism to genuine excitement. But nobody I spoke to had ever encountered anything quite like it firsthand. One old-timer, a man I'd known professionally for nearly 2 decades and trusted more than most, actually laughed on the phone and told me I must be describing a corroded balance shaft or some other ordinary component I'd simply misidentified in the excitement of the moment. And I understood his skepticism even as it stung a little, because I know exactly how implausible it sounds until you've stood over the open block yourself with your own 2 eyes. The closest anyone came to an explanation was an old engineer, retired from one of the major manufacturers decades ago, who told me over the phone that during certain lean years, particularly around wartime shortages when new engine castings were hard to come by, some farmers and small independent shops had been known to improvise, salvaging whatever power plants they could get their hands on and building larger housings around them just to keep a tractor running when a proper replacement simply wasn't available at any price. It wasn't common, it wasn't documented anywhere official, because nobody who did this kind of improvised half-legal fabrication work particularly wanted a factory representative finding out about it. But it happened, quietly, in barns and small-town machine shops all across farm country, whenever desperation and ingenuity intersected at exactly the right moment. That explanation satisfied the mechanical question, but opened up an entirely different one, a question that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the people who might have done this work on this specific tractor at some specific point in a history I hadn't even started to piece together yet. I went back to the family who'd sold me the tractor, the nephew clearing out his late uncle's property, and asked him what he knew about the tractor's history before his uncle owned her. And he admitted, a little sheepishly, that he honestly didn't know much beyond the fact that she'd been in the family for as long as anyone could remember, passed down from his uncle's own father, a man who had died long before the nephew was even born. I drove out to the County Historical Society after that conversation, the same kind of quiet, dusty research that's become almost a second career for me at this point, chasing down old plat maps and newspaper archives and the occasional patient volunteer who remembers or whose parents remembered more than any official record ever bothered to write down. And there, in a yellowed newspaper clipping from a local paper that had stopped printing sometime in the 1950s, I found a small item, barely 2 paragraphs, about wartime shortages hitting local farm equipment dealers particularly hard, and a mention, almost in passing, of a local blacksmith known throughout the county for his ability to keep old machinery running through what the article delicately called unconventional means, when factory parts simply weren't available at any price. I want to tell you plainly that I don't know for certain this blacksmith is the man who built that second engine into my Ford tractor's block. I have no signed confession, no dated invoice, nothing that would satisfy a courtroom. What I have is a strong suspicion built on timing, geography, and the particular kind of desperate, resourceful ingenuity that era demanded of men who refused to let a broken machine mean a season of lost work. And honestly, at a certain point in this kind of research, you have to make peace with suspicion instead of certainty, because some stories from that far back simply don't leave behind the kind of proof a modern mind wants before it's willing to believe. What I can tell you with total certainty is what I decided to do once I understood what I was looking at, because that decision mattered more to me than solving the historical mystery ever could. That smaller engine, welded into the housing of the larger Ford power plant, was never going to run again in any practical sense, not without invasive modification that would have destroyed whatever historical value it carried. But it also wasn't actively hurting anything once I understood its geometry properly, once I recognized that the strange sound I'd been chasing was simply the acoustic signature of 2 different pieces of cast iron, decades apart in age and manufacture, resonating together in a way no factory engineer had ever intended or accounted for. I rebuilt the larger Ford engine properly around that hidden heart, replacing what needed replacing, machining what needed machining, being exceptionally careful throughout the entire process not to disturb those old welds or that smaller silent power plant nested inside. I wanted her to run true, wanted that strange, doubled sound resolved into a single honest rhythm, but I also wanted to preserve the evidence of whatever desperate, resourceful farmer or blacksmith had once looked at a tractor with a dead engine and a wartime shortage of replacements, and decided, rather than let good farmland go unworked, he would simply build something new around something old and make it run again through sheer, stubborn ingenuity. I think about that blacksmith often now, whoever he was, working in some drafty shop decades ago with tools that would look primitive to anyone trained today, staring at a broken tractor and a farm full of people depending on it, and deciding that impossible was simply a word for a problem he hadn't solved yet. I never found his name for certain. I never will, most likely, and I've made a strange kind of peace with that uncertainty, because some of the best stories in this line of work end not with a name and a date, but with proof that someone, once, cared enough to try something nobody else would have attempted. That's its own kind of legacy, maybe a better one than a name on a plaque. A silent engine still beating quietly inside a larger one, still holding its shape and its secret 60 or 70 years later, asking nothing of anyone except to be noticed by whoever finally listened closely enough. The day I finally started her, after months of careful, patient work, that sound was gone entirely, replaced by the clean, single-note idle of an engine running exactly the way its rebuilt components were designed to run. But I sat there in the seat for a long while afterward, engine humming steady beneath me, thinking about the fact that somewhere inside that block, silent now, sealed forever behind fresh gaskets and new hardware, there was still a smaller, older heart that had once kept this whole machine alive when nothing else could have. I think about that a lot in this work, honestly. How many of the machines I restore are carrying secrets like that? hidden solutions built by desperate, clever hands decades before I ever laid my own hands on them. Patched together, not by any manufacturer's blueprint, but by pure human refusal to let good land go unplowed and good families go hungry. I keep a photograph of that open block pinned above my workbench now. Both halves laid open like the pages of a book nobody expected to find words inside. And every visitor who steps into that barn and asks about it gets the whole story, start to finish, because some discoveries are too strange and too good to keep to yourself. I've told it so many times now that I've started noticing which details make people lean forward and which ones make them go quiet. And it's always the same moment that gets them every time. Not the discovery itself, but the fact that engine ran silent and hidden for who knows how many decades, doing its small invisible work inside a larger machine that never once told anyone it was there. Every rebuild teaches me the same lesson over and over, in different iron, in different barns, across different decades. Somebody, somewhere, always finds a way to keep the heart beating, even when the official answer says it can't be done. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and curious enough to split the block open, you find out exactly how they did it.